History remembers the generals, the battles, the cannons, but it often forgets the silent, invisible killer that marches alongside every army, the one that claims far more lives than any bullet or blade. September 1812, the aftermath of the Battle of Borodino. From the road, Belgian surgeon Dr. J.R.L. de Caro could hear the symphony of human misery, the cries of thousands of wounded soldiers, victims of Napoleon's brutal war of conquest. France had won a great victory against Imperial Russia, but it was a victory measured in an ocean of blood. 70,000 men lay dead or dying on the field. The fallen were forgotten by their retreating units, left to the grim mercy of the battlefield. De Caro watched in horror as local peasants, like vultures, moved among the bodies, stripping the dead of their filthy, lice-infested rags. Swarms of hungry rats and carrion birds feasted on the carcasses. The doctor forced the gruesome images from his mind. He had a duty to perform. Up ahead, a Russian Orthodox monastery, a holy place, had been converted into a makeshift field hospital. As he approached, he saw a soldier struggling to carry his wounded friend inside. Even from a distance, de Caro's experienced eye could tell the man wouldn't make it. He entered the hospital and immediately covered his mouth and nose. The air was a physical assault, thick with dust, candle smoke, and a stench so overpowering it made him gag. The smell of stale blood, human filth, and the sweet, sickly odor of decay. Suddenly, a shout erupted from the back of the room. A French officer, his eyes wide with madness, was batting at the air, raving about things de Caro couldn't understand. The man was burning with fever, completely delirious. And across his chest, the doctor saw it, a strange, distinctive rash of purplish spots. When de Caro tried to guide the officer back to his cot, he noted the man's skin was hot to the touch. He did what little he could, but a grim recognition washed over him. He had seen this illness before. He knew its power, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that it was far too late to save this soldier's life. A cold dread crept down his spine. He slowly looked around the crowded, filthy monastery. On the man in the next cot, on the one across the aisle, on the soldier moaning in the corner, he saw the same feverish glaze in their eyes, the same delirium, and the same damned rash. He realized with a jolt of pure terror, this wasn't a hospital. It was an incubator. The rash, seen by Dr. de Caro, was the calling card of an ancient killer. A disease that holds a unique, dark place in the pantheon of human suffering. Typhus. For centuries, it has repeatedly bent humanity to its will, emerging from the shadows to devastate Western Europe. People feared it for its terrifyingly high mortality rate and the lightning speed with which it spread through crowded prisons and the filthy holds of ships. But its truest, most devastating companion was war. In fact, the first definitive record of typhus comes from a war zone, the Siege of Granada, 1489. As Spanish Catholic troops laid siege to the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, a mysterious plague erupted in their camp. Within a year, it had killed 17,000 soldiers. They called it spotted fever, for the angry red and purple welts it left on the skin. The first truly detailed clinical description of this horror comes from an Italian physician, Girolamo Fracastoro, in 1546. He observed how an otherwise healthy man would suddenly feel dizzy, as if the world were tilting on its axis. Hours later, a splitting headache would arrive, accompanied by a raging fever and bone-rattling chills. Then came the excruciating muscle aches, a pain so profound it could knock a grown man to the ground, unable to move. After 5 agonizing days, the spots would appear. Hundreds of tiny red and purple dots, called petechia, erupting across the entire body, sparing only the face, the palms of the hands, and the soles of the feet. As the fever worsened, a crippling fatigue would set in, and within the first week, the disease would launch its assault on the mind. The infection would cause the brain itself to swell, triggering vivid, terrifying hallucinations. Patients would hear voices, see people who weren't there, laugh uncontrollably, or spout gibberish. Some went blind, others deaf. After 2 weeks, the final gruesome stage began. The disease would systematically destroy the vascular system. Deprived of oxygen, the patient's fingers and toes would turn black with gangrene. From that point on, there were only 2 possible outcomes that could bring an end to the unimaginable pain: recovery or death. But what caused this horror? Fracastoro, like all physicians of his time, was trapped by the flawed science of the ancient Greeks. He believed the body was governed by 4 humors, and that sickness was simply an imbalance of these fluids. He prescribed powders and herbs to restore this delicate balance, but, of course, his treatments were completely useless. The disease continued its relentless spread. And it was the spread that truly bothered Fracastoro. At the time, the dominant theory of contagion was the miasma theory. Most doctors believed that disease was carried by bad air, foul odors emanating from garbage, swamps, and decaying corpses. This miasma, they thought, literally poisoned the air, and anyone who breathed it would fall ill. But as Fracastoro watched spotted fever leap from person to person, the miasma theory didn't quite fit. He began to imagine something else, a concept that was centuries ahead of its time. He pictured the disease not as a bad smell, but as an invisible seed, a kind of poisoned life form. These seeds, he theorized, would enter a victim's body, multiply, and then spread to others, making them contagious. By this logic, the only way to stop an epidemic was not to purify the air, but to isolate the sick. It was a brilliant, prescient idea, but in medieval Europe, it was utterly impractical. How could you isolate people in the squalid, overcrowded confines of a jail, or in the belly of a filthy ship? These places were perfect incubators for the disease, fertile breeding grounds for the fever. And no environment was more fertile than the chaos and filth of a battlefield. Nothing stoked the fires of pestilence like war, and another one was already brewing. In 1525, 2 of Europe's most powerful kings were locked in a desperate struggle for control. And spotted fever was about to decide the winner. After the Spanish army of Emperor Charles V brutally sacked Rome, their victory was cut short by a familiar enemy. A plague outbreak tore through their ranks. The now weakened Spanish army retreated to Naples and barricaded themselves inside, exhausted and outnumbered. In the summer of 1528, the French army, 28,000 strong, marched on their position. Victory for the French seemed inevitable. But then, like a twisted form of divine intervention, spotted fever struck. Not the Spanish this time, but the French. It swept through the French camp with the speed and ferocity of a forest fire. In less than a single month, the disease wiped out more than half of the entire army. The few who remained were demoralized, sick, and weak. After the dust settled, the numbers were almost unbelievable. Of the original 28,000 French soldiers, only 4,000 were left alive. Charles V was the triumphant winner, not because of his military genius, but because of a microscopic killer. From there, the devastation only grew. Efforts to contain the outbreaks were useless. Typhus burned through Europe's crowded jails and filthy ships. Those same ships then carried the disease to the New World, where it unleashed an even greater Holocaust. One Spanish observer estimated that a single epidemic in 1576, in what is now Mexico, killed more than 2 million indigenous people. For centuries, medicine was powerless against this ferocious demon. But in the 18th century, one man, a ship's surgeon, would finally uncover the first real clue. His name was Dr. James Lind. Sailing with the British Royal Navy, he experienced firsthand the floating hell of an 18th century warship. He slept in dark, cramped, suffocating quarters, surrounded by rats, fleas, and lice. Disease ran rampant, but the most lethal of all was ship fever, just another name for typhus. The Navy was so desperate for sailors that so-called press gangs would roam the streets, essentially kidnapping men for service. These involuntary recruits were often destitute, dressed in the same filthy rags they were caught in. Some were already sick, and the moment they were brought aboard, an outbreak would begin. Lind, a man of science, spent years meticulously collecting data, and he noticed a startling correlation. The ships with the cleanest sailors had the lowest number of infections. In 1763, he published a revolutionary paper. He asserted that ship fever was not caused by bad air, but was somehow carried in infected clothing. His recommendations were radical for the time. He asked the Navy to provide all new recruits with fresh clothes, soap, and water. And he advised that they be quarantined for 2 weeks to ensure no one already sick brought the disease aboard. In 1781, the British Admiralty finally adopted his recommendations, and within a few decades, they had almost completely eradicated typhus from their ships. It was a staggering success. But this life-saving knowledge spread with agonizing slowness. And at the dawn of the 19th century, in the largest army the world had ever seen, hygiene was still a foreign concept. A fatal oversight that would lead to unimaginable devastation. June 1812. The largest army the world had ever seen was on the march. Napoleon Bonaparte, self-declared Emperor of France, had conquered nearly all of Western Europe. Now he aimed his war machine at his final great rival, Russia. On the eve of the invasion, more than 600,000 of his soldiers camped by the Niemen River. This Grande Armée, as it was called, was a literal city on wheels, with its own mobile hospitals, jails, and taverns. It was the pinnacle of military organization. But, unbeknownst to Napoleon and his generals, this magnificent army had an uninvited guest. Hundreds of thousands of his soldiers were crammed into barracks with no sanitation to speak of. Their glorious city on wheels had become an enormous, mobile petri dish. Soldiers began to fall ill at an alarming rate. First, with the typical diseases of war, dysentery, hepatitis. But then, a new sickness began to spread with terrifying speed, outpacing all the others: spotted fever. The Army's doctors had a new name for it by then: typhus, from the Greek word typhos, meaning smoke or haze. It was a reference to the confused, stupor-like state that overcame its victims as they went into shock. The number of sick soldiers was growing exponentially. The warning signs were everywhere. And yet, Napoleon, supremely confident in his destiny, ordered everyone to march on. Napoleon's arrogance would be his army's death sentence. He deeply mistrusted doctors, once calling medicine the science of assassins. His medical corps was a low priority, often staffed with men simply unfit to fight on the front lines. His stubborn refusal to heed the warnings of this growing plague meant that his loyal, sick soldiers would pay the ultimate price. By the time the Grande Armée limped into Moscow in September, it was already a ghost of its former self. As many as 200,000 men had already died, not from Russian cannons, but from disease. And the number one killer was typhus. Even those who survived the initial infection were left shattered, weakened by chronic fatigue, brain damage, and a massive loss of weight that left them vulnerable to starvation and the brutal Russian winter. The march home was a death march. By the end of November, just 5 months after the invasion began, Napoleon's forces had utterly withered away. From over 500,000 men to less than 40,000. It was a staggering, almost unimaginable loss. Napoleon would never again raise such a large army. He was utterly, comprehensively defeated. And the tragedy was, he hadn't even recognized his true enemy until it was far, far too late. His grand ambitions were not shattered by the Tsar, but by a microscopic organism he could not see. In truth, it's unlikely Napoleon could have ever prevented the epidemic. His doctors were helpless. They couldn't stop the spread of typhus because they didn't know how it spread. And their cures were useless because they had no idea of its root cause. The enemy was invisible. But even as Napoleon's army was marching to its doom, the tools to unmask that enemy were already being perfected. The quest for answers had begun almost 2 centuries earlier in the Netherlands. There, a Dutch scientist named Antony van Leeuwenhoek did something no human had ever done before. Using his own handcrafted microscopes, he peered into a drop of pond water and discovered an entire unseen universe teeming with life. He called the thousands of tiny, squirming creatures he saw animalcules. His discovery was met with ridicule. The idea of invisible animals swimming in a drop of water sounded like madness. But Leeuwenhoek was undeterred. He invited scholars from across Europe to his laboratory, urging them to look through his microscope and see for themselves. Leeuwenhoek was the first person in history to see bacteria. But he, and everyone who followed, saw them only as biological curiosities. It never occurred to them that these tiny animalcules could be the hidden architects of mankind's most devastating plagues. And so, for another 200 years, as typhus continued its reign of terror, no one made the connection. And so typhus continued to ravage the globe. One of the biggest obstacles in fighting it was a simple yet deadly case of mistaken identity. By sheer, tragic coincidence, typhus shares many of its most prominent symptoms: fatigue, muscle aches, high fever, and a spotted rash, with a completely unrelated disease: typhoid fever. For centuries, physicians believed they were one and the same. The first crucial step in solving the mystery came in 1835. An American physician named William Garhard dedicated himself to separating the two diseases. He published a paper noting the subtle but critical differences. Typhoid, he observed, almost always caused severe gastrointestinal issues, which were rare in typhus patients. But the most telling clue was the rash itself. The red spots on a typhoid patient would briefly disappear when pressed. The spots on a typhus patient, however, would not. This, a later textbook explained, was because the marks of typhus were not just a surface rash. They were tiny, ruptured blood vessels, bleeding just under the skin. It was a sign of the disease's systemic assault on the body's circulatory system. The evidence mounted. Autopsies revealed that typhoid patients had distinctive lesions in their intestines, while typhus patients did not. And in 1873, another doctor made a vital breakthrough. He proved that, unlike typhus, typhoid fever was spread through contaminated water. The two killers were finally being unmasked as separate entities. But while scientists were closing in on typhoid's secrets, the true nature of typhus remained a mystery. And then, the most significant breakthrough of all was about to arrive. In 1877, a German bacteriologist named Robert Koch was studying anthrax, a deadly disease affecting sheep. In the blood of the dead animals, he observed distinctive rod-shaped bacteria. This wasn't new, but what Koch did next would change the world forever. He devised a way to extract these bacteria and keep them alive outside of a host by growing them in a nutrient-rich fluid. In his lab, he watched as these tiny organisms thrived and multiplied. Then, he performed the decisive experiment. He took his lab-grown culture and injected it back into healthy sheep. The sheep became sick. They developed anthrax. This was the smoking gun. The absolute, undeniable proof that these specific, microscopic, animalcules were the direct cause of this specific disease. More than that, Koch had finally proven the germ theory of disease. Leeuwenhoek's little creatures were not mere curiosities, they were killers. Koch's discovery unleashed a golden age of bacteriology. Scientists could now grow and isolate the germs behind humanity's greatest plagues. Within a few years, the bacterium responsible for typhoid was found. Dozens of others followed. But one ancient enemy continued to elude them. By the dawn of the 20th century, as scientists celebrated victory after victory, the true cause of typhus remained a complete and utter mystery. At the turn of the 20th century, typhus was still as great a threat as it had been in the Middle Ages. The link to hygiene had provided a powerful shield, but the enemy itself, its cause, its method of transmission, remained a ghost. In 1903, a French scientist named Dr. Charles Nicolle became determined to hunt that ghost. He took a position as the director of the Pasteur Institute in Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, a country where typhus was rampant. His mission was singular: to uncover the disease's deepest secrets. The danger of his work became immediately apparent. After 2 of his colleagues died from the disease investigating a prison outbreak, a shaken Nicolle realized just how high the stakes were. He became obsessed with one particular question: how exactly did typhus travel from one person to another? During an outbreak in 1906, he paid laser-focused attention to the flow of patients within his own hospital. He noted a strange, recurring pattern. An infected patient would arrive, feverish and exhausted. While waiting for a bed, they were highly contagious, infecting other patients in the waiting area, family members, and even the hospital attendants. But then, something remarkable would happen. The patient would be taken to a washroom. Their filthy street clothes would be removed to be cleaned, and they would be given a hospital gown. Once they were moved into the main ward, they were suddenly no longer infectious. They could cough and shiver all they wanted, but the patients in the beds next to them remained perfectly safe. Nicolle replayed this sequence of events in his mind over and over again. What was the magical dividing line? What was the one single thing that separated a contagious patient in the waiting room from a safe patient in the ward? And then, with a flash of insight, he had it. It wasn't the patient, it was their clothes. Nicolle's mind raced. Tunisia, especially in the poorer quarters where sanitation was lacking, was teeming with vermin, rats, ticks, fleas, and lice. Lice, in particular, were everywhere. The theory clicked perfectly into place. Lice live and reproduce in the seams of clothing. They jump off their human host several times a day to feed on blood. If washing a patient and removing their clothes also removed the lice, then perhaps that was the key. In 1909, Nicolle set out to prove it. His experiment was a brilliant, multi-stage process of elimination. First, he injected a chimpanzee with the blood of a human typhus patient. Within days, the chimp developed a fever and the telltale spotted rash. This was proof. The disease was in the blood. Next, He took blood from the sick chimp and injected it into a healthy macaque monkey, successfully transferring the disease again. Now came the final, crucial step. Once the second monkey was sick, Nicole allowed a colony of body lice to feed on it. He then took those now infected lice and placed them on a third, perfectly healthy macaque. The third monkey fell gravely ill. The verdict was in. The mystery that had plagued humanity for centuries was solved. It wasn't bad air. It wasn't a punishment from God. The true culprit, the vector that carried this ancient plague from person to person, was the common body louse. The discovery was a monumental victory for science, but the war against typhus was far from over, and it would continue to claim its casualties. Just a year later, an American researcher named Howard Ricketts, who had independently confirmed Nicole's findings, contracted the disease himself and died. The price of knowledge was often life itself. With the louse identified as the carrier, the next great challenge was clear: creating a vaccine. But to create a vaccine, you need a large, stable supply of the pathogen itself. And that was the problem facing a brilliant Polish parasitologist named Dr. Rudolph Weigel. As World War I drew to a close, Weigel was grappling with a strange logistical nightmare. The massive typhus epidemic that had raged during the war was finally receding. And as a result, infected human patients were becoming hard to find. Without infected humans for his lab-grown lice to feed on, he had no way to cultivate the typhus bacteria he desperately needed for his research. He tried using guinea pigs, but the rodents didn't get sick enough to reliably pass the infection back to the lice. The bacteria was dying out. One day, during a heated argument with a lab assistant about their dwindling supply, a frustrated Weigel exclaimed that if he couldn't feed the typhus to his lice, he would just have to put it directly up their anus. The assistant thought he was joking, but Weigel was deadly serious. He led the man to a lab bench, took a delicate glass pipette, and demonstrated his radical new idea. He performed the world's first micro-enema on a louse. The assistant was stunned. It was a bizarre, almost comical solution, but it was genius. Using this method, Weigel could now keep the Rickettsia bacteria alive indefinitely, passing it directly from louse to louse in his lab. For the first time, he had a reliable source. And if he could scale up this strange new process, he might just be able to generate enough bacteria to produce the world's first effective vaccine against typhus. With his new method, Weigel developed an elaborate, bizarre, and incredibly dangerous system for farming lice and harvesting the typhus bacteria. It was a production line unlike any other in the world. It began with lice eggs hatched in temperature-controlled cabinets. The newborn larvae were moved into tiny, matchbox-sized cages with a mesh bottom. These cages were then strapped directly onto the legs of human volunteers. For 10 days, the lice would feed on the volunteers' blood. The experience was described as excruciating. The first thing you feel, one volunteer recalled, is like a hot iron as 500 or 1,000 of them pierce your skin. Once the lice reached maturity, they were brought back to the lab for the most critical step. Weigel and his team would painstakingly inject each and every louse via its rectum with a solution containing the typhus bacteria. These newly infected lice then had to feed for another 5 days to allow the bacteria to multiply. But they were now highly infectious. So they could only be fed on volunteers who had already survived typhus and had some natural immunity, including Weigel himself. 6 days after being infected, the lice would begin to die. This was the moment of harvest. Weigel's team would dissect each tiny insect with a scalpel, remove its intestines, crush them into a paste, and dilute the mixture with saline. This slurry was then treated with phenol to kill the bacteria. This gruesome cocktail of lice guts and chemicals was the vaccine. The scale of the work was staggering. Weigel estimated he needed the intestines of 100 lice to create enough vaccine for a single person. And the work was beyond hazardous. More than one of Weigel's colleagues became infected in the lab and died. Despite the promise of his work, Weigel himself was deeply worried about the risks, and he refused to test his vaccine on human subjects. But one of his colleagues, a bacteriologist named Helene Sparrow, was more than willing. In 1928, she and Dr. Charles Nicole, the man who first identified the louse as the carrier, conducted the first human trial. By today's standards, their methods would be considered monstrously unethical. They vaccinated 4 young children, and then, several months later, deliberately exposed them to typhus. Their justification was that the disease was rarely fatal in the young. The gamble paid off. By the end of the trial, none of the vaccinated children became sick. The news reached Weigel's lab, and another researcher, emboldened by the success, tested the vaccine on his own wife. Weigel was furious at the unauthorized trial, but the result was undeniable. The woman remained healthy. It was official. Mankind finally had its first effective vaccine against typhus. Weigel now faced a new challenge. If he could find a way to mass-produce his creation, he could potentially stop the next great epidemic in its tracks. And the need for that vaccine was growing far greater and far faster than he could have ever imagined. Throughout the 1930s, Poland was quickly becoming a very dangerous place. The shadow of Nazi Germany was looming. A new war was coming, a war that would consume more than 50 million lives. And every government, on every side, wanted to know how its old companion, typhus, would affect the outcome. In Nazi Germany, long-held beliefs about public health fused with a twisted, insidious ideology: racial hygiene. Nazi propaganda shrouded ancient anti-Semitism in the language of modern medicine. The Jew, wrote one infamous Nazi editor, is a bacillus and a plague. In September 1939, this hateful ideology was unleashed upon the world. Germany invaded Poland, sparking World War II. The Nazis immediately began forcing Jewish people into tiny, overcrowded ghettos, deliberately depriving them of food, water, and sanitation. In their perverse logic, this was simply an efficient form of quarantine. But their attempt to contain this so-called plague backfired spectacularly. As we have seen, crowded, filthy conditions are the perfect breeding ground for typhus. The disease exploded within the ghettos, and then, inevitably, spread to the German soldiers standing guard outside. By 1941, the German army was facing a full-blown epidemic. Desperate, they turned to the one man in Poland who could help them, Rudolph Weigel. Hitler had personally ordered the execution of Poland's scientists and intellectuals. But the threat from typhus was so great, the Nazis realized that Weigel was simply too valuable to kill. A German officer gave Weigel an ultimatum: continue your research and surrender every dose of your vaccine to the German army, or be executed. Working under direct Nazi supervision, Weigel began to scale up his production. And he did something incredibly brave. He began hiring dozens of his colleagues, professors, doctors, scientists, the intellectual heart of Poland, all of whom were on Nazi death lists. In the middle of an occupied city, the Weigel Institute became the only safe haven for these condemned intellectuals. It was an ark of science, floating in an ocean of unimaginable horror. Working tirelessly, day and night, Weigel transformed his laboratory into a breathtakingly efficient assembly line for vaccine production. He invented new instruments to speed up the process, including a special clamp that could hold 50 lice at a time, perfectly positioned for rectal injection. His staff was organized into specialized teams. The injectors would load the clamps and pass them to a partner who, with a single press of a pump, could infect all 50 lice at once. Together, they could infect 2,000 lice an hour. Another team, the dissectors, would pull the guts from the dead lice with a needle, harvesting the precious bacteria at a rate of 300 lice per hour. And then there were the feeders. Weigel needed hundreds of them to nourish the tens of millions of lice his lab processed. Every morning, men and women would show up, strap dozens of cages to their bare legs, and endure the painful bites. But they never complained, because as long as they were inside the walls of that laboratory, under Weigel's protection, they were safe. And many of these feeders were more than just volunteers. They were members of the dwindling Polish resistance. Weigel used his unique position to help them smuggle thousands of vials of his life-saving vaccine into the Jewish ghettos, where typhus was now killing nearly a third of the population. Some even used the lab's resources for a more direct form of sabotage, secretly smearing typhus-infected louse feces on German trains, turning the Nazis' greatest fear back on them like a biological weapon. One of the people saved by Weigel's protection was his old colleague, Dr. Ludwik Fleck. Fleck was immensely grateful for the precious vials of vaccine that were smuggled into the ghetto, but he knew it wasn't enough. Each delivery felt like a single drop of water on an inferno. Weigel's method was brilliant, but it was slow and laborious. Fleck was convinced there had to be a better, faster way to produce a vaccine than infecting and dissecting millions of tiny insects one by one. Working in a small, makeshift hospital lab inside the ghetto, Fleck began a series of daring experiments. He started with a strange observation. The urine of typhus patients, while containing no living bacteria, and therefore not contagious, still contained the chemical fingerprints of the disease, the antigens. This sparked a radical idea. If he could harvest enough of these antigens from the urine, perhaps they alone could be used to train the immune system. Perhaps they could be the vaccine. Fleck devised a crude but effective system, baking the urine to concentrate it into a thick liquid, then filtering out the impurities. He injected this bizarre concentrate into a group of guinea pigs, and then exposed them to live typhus. To his absolute elation, none of them got sick. Ludwik Fleck had just invented a completely new type of vaccine. But his small ghetto lab could never produce it in the quantities needed to save his people. To do that, he would need industrial equipment. He would need a factory. And to get that, he would have to make a terrifying gamble. He requested a meeting with a group of Nazi officers and doctors and presented his findings inside the local Gestapo headquarters. Fleck's incredible gamble paid off. The Nazis' fear of typhus was so great that they gave him access to a chemical factory. He spent the next several months refining his urine-based vaccine, even testing it on himself and his family. From the factory, he secretly diverted thousands of doses, operating a clandestine clinic in the ghetto where he vaccinated his own people. But his heroism was short-lived. A few months later, an informant tipped off the Nazis. Ludwik Fleck and his family were arrested and sent to the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp. Buchenwald was a death factory, a place where the Nazis murdered nearly 50,000 human beings. But, surprisingly, Dr. Fleck was not one of them. His captors saw him not as a man to be gassed, but as a resource to be exploited. And Fleck was extremely valuable. He was taken to a drab, sinister building known as Block 50. It was a secret laboratory run by a sadistic SS doctor who was obsessed with creating his own typhus vaccine to rival Weigel's. He had assembled a team of Jewish scientists, pulling them from the lines of execution and forcing them to experiment on their fellow inmates. But by 1943, they had made zero progress. And then Ludwik Fleck arrived, a prisoner in a striped uniform who knew more about the microbiology of typhus than almost anyone else alive. Fleck was now trapped in a terrifying moral dilemma. He was not about to use his genius to help the Nazi war machine. But if he refused to cooperate, he would be immediately executed. So he devised a plan of breathtaking audacity, a plan of scientific sabotage. He told the SS doctor he could replicate a new, highly complex French technique for growing the typhus bacteria in rabbit lungs. The method was so difficult that no one else in Block 50 had been able to make it work. But Fleck pulled it off. To this day, no one knows exactly how, because he deliberately falsified his notes to keep the secret from his captors. He and his team of prisoner scientists produced a new, potent rabbit-derived vaccine. When they tested it on their fellow inmates, it proved remarkably effective. The sadistic SS doctor was ecstatic. German High Command immediately ordered huge quantities of this new wonder vaccine to be shipped to the disease-ridden Eastern Front. But the vast majority of that vaccine never reached Russia. Instead, Fleck and his team shipped a fake, a useless placebo vaccine. The production process was so complex that Fleck correctly gambled that no one would notice if he accidentally flubbed a critical step. While the German army received vials of worthless liquid, Fleck kept the real vaccine hidden, using it to secretly inoculate his fellow inmates. Historians estimate that as many as 200,000 German soldiers were vaccinated with this faulty serum. Thanks to Ludwik Fleck's quiet, brilliant sabotage from inside a death camp, thousands of Nazi soldiers succumbed to typhus. While Fleck was waging his secret war in Buchenwald, the Allies were facing their own desperate race against time. They were completely cut off from Weigel's laboratory, and with it, the world's only proven vaccine. And they needed one, urgently. In early 1942, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was planning Operation Torch, the massive Allied invasion of North Africa. Military intelligence knew the region was a hotbed for typhus. They expected the disease to wreak havoc on their troops, just as it had on countless armies before them. The directive was clear. If they couldn't develop a vaccine before the landing, thousands upon thousands of soldiers would die. The situation was dire. Weigel, the master, was working for the enemy. There was no known cure. But, fortunately, the Allies had a secret weapon of their own. An American bacteriologist named Dr. Harold Cox. Years earlier, Cox had been studying a close relative of typhus, a disease called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Transmitted by ticks, it's not as contagious as typhus, but it is even more deadly, causing a raging fever and hallucinations before triggering catastrophic septic shock. Cox was determined to create a vaccine for it, and his research would prove to be the key to solving the Allies' desperate problem. Dr. Cox faced the same fundamental problem as Weigel: how to keep the notoriously fragile Rickettsia bacteria alive and multiplying in the lab. But he had read about a new, experimental tactic that might just solve the problem. He wasn't going to use lice or guinea pigs. He was going to use chicken eggs. The logic was brilliant. A fertile chicken egg is the perfect natural incubator. It's a completely sterile environment, protected from outside germs by the shell. And, crucially, the developing embryo inside lacks a mature immune system to fight off infection. It was a defenseless, self-contained bioreactor. Cox began his work. He took blood from infected guinea pigs and carefully injected it into the yolk sacs of the eggs. The Rickettsia bacteria didn't just survive, they thrived, replicating rapidly in the nutrient-rich environment. Cox then perfected a method to increase the concentration, transferring material from one infected egg to the next. Once he had a massive culture of bacteria, he could easily separate it from the yolk and then kill the microbes with phenol to create a safe, inactivated vaccine. After only 2 years of research, he had done it. He had a working vaccine for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And his timing couldn't have been more perfect. That very year, Cox accidentally contracted the deadly disease himself. His own vaccine saved his life. With the threat of World War II looming, he immediately adapted his revolutionary technique to the bacteria that causes typhus. By early 1942, as Eisenhower was planning the invasion of North Africa, Dr. Cox began shipping the first doses to the U.S. Army. He continued to refine his methods, and soon his laboratory was a mass-production powerhouse, churning out 90,000 doses of typhus vaccine every single day. Cox's vaccine was a miracle, but it was only one half of the solution. To truly defeat typhus, the Allies needed to kill not just the bacteria, but the lice that carried it. The search for a powerful, safe insecticide had been ongoing for decades. And in Switzerland, a chemist named Paul Hermann Müller finally found it. After testing hundreds and hundreds of different chemical compounds, he discovered one with almost magical killing power. He doused a cage of flies with it, and they died instantaneously. Further tests showed it was just as lethal to mosquitoes and to lice. The compound's name was DDT. DDT attacks the nervous system of an insect, causing its nerves to fire uncontrollably, triggering fatal spasms. It was the perfect chemical weapon. In 1943, the U.S. Typhus Commission got their hands on it and immediately understood its potential. They developed power dusters that could blow the fine white powder over huge numbers of people at once, killing the lice hiding in their clothes. This two-pronged attack, Cox's vaccine to protect the soldiers from the inside, and DDT to kill the lice on the outside, was unstoppable. The combination was so effective that not a single American GI died of typhus during the entire war. The ultimate proof of its power came in December of 1943. A massive typhus outbreak erupted among the civilian population in newly liberated Naples, Italy. The Allies responded immediately. In a massive public health campaign, they dusted over 1 million people with DDT and distributed millions of doses of Cox vaccine. For the first time in the long, bloody history of warfare, a full-blown typhus epidemic was stopped dead in its tracks. But while the Allies were using their chemical knowledge to save civilian lives, the Germans were using theirs to commit the ultimate atrocity. The Nazis had their own insecticide programs, and their chemical of choice would become one of the most notorious substances in human history: hydrogen cyanide. German chemists had stabilized the deadly gas into solid pellets that could be safely transported and then released on command. It was sold by the infamous I.G. Farben Company under the trade name Zyklon B. Obsessed with eliminating typhus from their ranks, the Nazis used vast quantities of it to fumigate the barracks and clothing of millions of soldiers and civilians. But then, the Nazi bureaucracy, led by men like Adolf Eichmann, made a final monstrous leap of logic. They decided that if this chemical could be used to efficiently exterminate lice, it could be used to exterminate people. They herded more than 1 million human beings, men, women, and children, into rooms disguised as showers. They sealed the doors, and then they filled the rooms with Zyklon B gas. The chemical that was developed to fight a plague became the very instrument of a genocide. After the war, the scientific victories continued. In 1948, researchers analyzing a soil sample from a Missouri hayfield discovered a powerful new class of drugs, antibiotics. And when they tested their new creation, tetracycline, against the Rickettsia bacteria, it wiped it out completely. This was the final nail in the coffin. Thanks to the monumental work of pioneers like Harold Cox with his egg vaccine, Paul Mueller with DDT, and the discovery of antibiotics, the age of epidemic typhus was over. Wherever it dared to appear, health authorities could now swoop in with a powerful arsenal of vaccines, insecticides, and cures. An outbreak in Burundi in 1997 was the last major epidemic in history. Today, most doctors will go their entire careers without ever seeing a single case. The ancient killer that toppled empires and decided the fate of wars has been reduced to a medical footnote, easily treated. The victory was paid for in blood. Men like Howard Ricketts and Stanislaus Prochaska and countless other doctors and scientists gave their lives in this long, brutal war. Their legacy lives on in the millions of lives they saved. And yet, typhus was not defeated entirely. It still had one last trick up its sleeve. Scientists have since discovered that the bacteria can live on, hiding in animal reservoirs like flying squirrels in the United States. And while epidemic typhus is gone, its close cousins, diseases like scrub typhus and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, carried by different insects, are still very much with us. We may have won the Great War against this ancient plague, but its shadow, its echo, lingers on. A quiet, constant reminder that the battle between humanity and the invisible world is never truly over.